Everyone. How are you doing?
Hello. Yeah, I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. This week, very interesting topic we've been researching, right?
Definitely. I can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah. So we are looking at salt and the links between salt intake and stress, and the links between salt and aggression and some other health and behavioral effects that salt intake can drive. So yeah, very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it's something that I think we hear so much about salt and our health, and often we don't know. We kind of have this idea that salt is bad, but we don't know why, and we don't know what it affects in the body. We don't know how much is at the right level because we do need some salt, for contracting and relaxing our muscles, maintaining fluid balance, nervous system impulses, and preventing low blood pressure and stuff like that. But there's a lot of harm that can be done from too much salt as well. So I wonder, kind of, yeah, what have you been investigating with salt and stress? That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it is very interesting. So there's this new research that came out that is looking at activation of HPA axis. So for those who need a little bit introduction into neuroscience and biologic terminology, so it is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? So it's how different glands in our body are connected to then drive stress response, essentially. So HPA is responsible mainly for stress response, but there are a lot of other processes as well that is involved in. So definitely sodium is one of those key ingredients that has very interesting role in our health, and it definitely affects a lot of processes in physiological processes in our body that are very, very closely linked. And we already knew for a long time that high salt intake definitely affects, let's say fluids in the body, that it affects liver, it affects kidneys. There's a lot of processes there that affects from physical health side effect. But the effect on stress and stress system activation is quite new. So that research is incredibly interesting. And yeah, so high salt intake elevates production of stress hormones essentially. So it makes your stress much more stronger,
Mm,
makes it more difficult as well to self-regulate, I guess, in that way, because um, so what is salt? So salt is really sodium mainly, and sodium plays a huge role in neuronal communication. So the way how messages are being passed on across these channels of neuronal communication, it's very important to have that level of salt for these kind of healthy neurons of communicating with one another. So when we put too much salt, we are actually now driving the level of these chemical metabolic processes to different level, and we are over activating everything, and we are kind of overburdening the system with this. And it's
mm,
incredibly interesting because then what it does that it when that system activates, it increases your levels of cortisol, and obviously we know the effects of chronic stress on the body, right? There's so many different processes in the way how it increases load on cardiovascular system. It then affects your digestion. There's so many processes that are happening
mm,
that are harmful for our health, and creating a lot of these chronic conditions.
mm. And it's the kind of that background stress, as well as creating a lot of chronic physical conditions, can, just like you say, kind of make our self-regulation harder because it
Mhm.
means that we're approaching every emotion from a state of stress, from a state of background stress anyway. So even if we're feeling a bit nervous about something, we'll interpret those feelings, or we're maybe more likely to interpret those feelings of nerves as nerves rather than excitement and things like that. So having that background stress a lot of the time, I imagine, can have a really kind of strong effect maybe on our personalities, you know, on our relationships with people, and on kind of the qualities that we consider probably as independent from our diets or from our levels of salt. But actually salt can have that kind of effect on our overriding personalities. And I wonder, you mentioned kind of when we were talking about this, about how salt, and maybe it's linked in this way, I'm not sure, but how salt can have effect on levels of aggression. That was very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yes, it does. Because when you think about this, what happens to your way of being and way of responding to triggers and to environment when your stress response is elevated, right?
Mm,
You are under threat, essentially. Your body is physically in that threat state, which means it's ready for an attack. And it's actually oversensitive to any triggers, to any external threats, right?
mm,
And from that response, of course, if you are already in that state, it is very, very easy to kind of like lash out and to self-regulate ourselves and to respond in a right way. So then that elevated stress response, absolutely, I believe that in those in response to some of these environmental triggers, or other people, situations, whatever is happening, that are driving aggression. So definitely there's been even I don't have some of those stats like in front of me to refer to, but there are links between even like levels of crime committed and your level of stress in the body, which is then linked to, let's say, your neurochemical composition,
mm.
which includes very high level of sodium in your body, right? So now this research that links salt intake to the increase of HPA axis explains this, because before there were some of these links between specific diets, let's say, and even aggression, but it's like well, it's a myth, because you cannot explain the mechanism of how exactly this process is being driven, right?
Interesting. That's so fascinating, because I think that it points to these ideas of, we know about good diets and bad diets and these broad rules. But I think we often don't think about how pervasive the effects of that are. So we think about it simply in terms of our physical health. And as usual, we often don't make the connection between our emotional states and our mental states and our physical states, our physical health. So kind of learning about how increased salt, or kind of eating too much salt, can increase our stress response and then make us more susceptible and more prone to committing crimes. I mean, that if
Yeah.
you're motivated enough for your physical health, for your heart conditions or your liver conditions or kidney conditions, I mean, I think this is just another reason to be really mindful of our salt intake. And I suppose that brings me on a little bit to thinking about how much salt we should be having, because I think that can be quite hard as well. And there are some kind of blanket rules that we can
Guidelines, yeah.
follow with it. Yeah. I wonder, what you have found with that.
Yeah, there are. I've been looking at some of those guidelines, and it really made me laugh, because I was looking at the medical news, and in the statistics there, it was data that said Americans should have 2,300 milligrams of salt a day. And it was like, oh, really? Why do you like,
Oh,
are Americans different kind of human species that they need different type of salt? But it really made me laugh. So, yeah, so apparently the health guidelines are saying that we should consume around 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day. And most diets in kind of Western world, so when we're looking at kind of US, UK mainly, we have like 3,400 is the average in our diets. So
Wow.
it's quite a big increase in that. So there's that kind of excess salt that is now in our system, in our bodies, that are driving that stress response. And as we know as well, that stress response is, well, stress. It's just a very big problem nowadays anyway, right? Because the way we live is just so far away from how our bodies have evolved to thrive. So when we look at introduction of processed foods and the way we eat differently now to the way we are supposed to be eating, there are so many different health issues that have been created by us not kind of living in sync with nature, with environment, and not eating natural foods.
Mm.
So high levels of salt and high levels of sugar and a lot of other kind of chemicals, additive, preservatives, um, always are found in processed foods.
Mm.
And the more processed foods we eat, the more difficult for our body it is to process it, because first of all, like for millions of years, we didn't have these kind of chemically processed foods. You put it inside your body doesn't know what to do with it because
Mm.
it's just never been
That's it.
digesting and processing something like that. So the biggest poison, I would say, is also some of the things that are advertised as healthy. So, for example, these like protein bars, like nutritional bars, it's like load like energy bars. These are pure bloody chemicals. In the way, even if you're saying that is derived out of, yes, some of them you can say it's not, it's derived from natural ingredients and so on, but it's processed. It's processed to the point where it's not presented in its natural form. So chemically, it's very different, even if it's extracted from natural ingredients in some ways, right? So it is a processed food and it's not healthy. So even if it on a label it says that it's it has some of these vitamins, minerals, whatever that is that our bodies need, the way it's presented is in a form that it's pretty much impossible for our body to actually process it in a healthy way. So we are creating a lot of health issues by eating the so-called health bars.
Well, that's it. And because a lot of these things, we in our society, food travels remarkable distances to get to us, and it sits on shelves for a while, and then we buy it, and then it sits in our cupboards for a while, and then maybe eventually we eat it. And that's not natural. If we were living in a more kind of localized system and with more agricultural living, where you're essentially living off your local land, there isn't that much time between food, plants being picked or harvested and you eating them. So we wouldn't need all of these preservatives, but we introduce salt and sugar and process our foods so that we can preserve it. Now, we are also extremely lucky to live in a world where we can access fresh whole foods very readily from the supermarket. So what I would really encourage in kind of approaching or thinking about salt in our diet is, rather than looking for things that are packaged as natural, just get the whole foods. So if you can tell, if that's what it looked like when it came off the tree or when it was dug out of the ground or wherever, then that's a whole food. That's natural. If it doesn't look like it could have been picked off a
Yeah,
tree or come straight from the land, then that's unnatural, regardless of how much
yeah,
marketing or branding might say that it's a natural product. And something to be really aware of as well is our tastes. So our tastes change and adapt and develop depending on what we are eating. We habitualize to different eating patterns, and then our tastes change in response to that. Anyone who's kind of gone through a journey with having more or less sugar or salt will notice that when they have, the more they have, the more they want to have. The less they have, the less they eventually want to have. Obviously, at first, you have that craving and you want to just kind of have the high levels
yeah,
that you've been habitualized to. But once we start reducing the levels of salt and sugar in our diets, we actually can taste other elements of the food better. So we'll appreciate those flavors better. So it really, really is worthwhile trying to slowly and comfortably. I don't advise doing anything in kind of extremes, because I don't think it's sustainable, but slowly and comfortably reducing our salt and sugar intake, but specifically talking about salt today. And there are various, ways we can do that. Obviously, eating whole foods. Lots of people believe that there are different types of salt that are better or worse for us. So there's a lot of a lot of talk and media around Himalayan pink salt, and the research done about that says that while the sodium levels are generally the same, it does also have some additional minerals, being potassium, magnesium, and calcium, which make the salt taste slightly differently and can taste saltier. So meaning we need a little bit less to achieve the same level of flavor. But what I would actually suggest with that is that while we might simply prefer the taste of pink salt, we also just want to be aware of the fact that we're trying to change our tastes. We're not only just trying to manipulate the product so that we can achieve the same result, we can actually manipulate ourselves and our taste so that we don't need so much salt, or we don't want so much salt in our diet.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so important to kind of highlight the taste, because we have these cravings, based on, what our body is used to, and based on kind of the levels that are familiar to our body. When that drops, your body will always try to restore the equilibrium, and you have, these cravings for something salty, for something sugary, for something, high fat, and so on, to kind of keep the same levels of it. But definitely, the way our body is metabolizing some of those ingredients can be tweaked, right? So our metabolic system and our digestive processes can be tweaked, and taste is a very good indicator of how is it changing and what is it missing in our bodies and what is not. It's very interesting because, salt, it just kind of enhances the flavors, really, right? So the salt in itself, it enhances a lot of other flavors in that, but it's also kind of overpowers some other things there. So definitely, over time, when you are having a lot of salt, what this means that your even taste buds become sensitized to that level of flavor. So anything less, now you can't taste it, right? So food becomes bland and not enjoyable anymore unless it has that high level of salt. And reducing it slowly, like you said, definitely allows us to discover a lot of these other flavors that are not necessarily activated by salt, right? So we can have that right balance. I had very interesting incident, I would say, when I had my operation, and there was some sort of a side effect to anesthetics. That when I came back after, when I woke up after operation, I've actually lost my taste, and completely, like completely. And it was, I know that some people will also relate to it because that was also a symptom of COVID, right? That there's our sense of smell, taste changes. But from COVID point of view, what we have actually lost was not really a taste. We actually lost sense of smell. Neurologically, sense of smell and sense of taste are very intrinsically linked. So on our tongue, let's say, the actual taste that we can detect is salt, so salty, sugary, so sweet, sour, bitter, and then also we have the so-called astringent taste, which is kind of like a stinging, dry kind of. It's more of a texture, really, rather than a flavor, really. And everything else actually comes from the smell. So the way the smell travels, there are different channels that we don't just inhale, but actually it travels that at the back of our throat. When we have kind of air channels opened, when we put something in our mouth and when we are chewing it, the smell molecules from that food actually travels the back of our throat to the back of our nose, and then it affects that smell. Those molecules are processed as part
Mm.
of the tasting of that food, but actually it's a from the senses, it's actually a sense of smell that then gives us a perception of specific taste. So
That's
it's
really
very,
interesting.
yeah,
And I think as well that's a really useful kind of piece of science to remember when we're thinking about getting the most flavor from things. So if you are trying to reduce your salt, or even if you are trying to reduce your overall food intake if you overeat, then getting the most flavor from a piece of food or any kind of meal is really important. And I guess it would make sense then that chewing your food for longer
mhm,
and properly. I mean, it's just good for
yeah.
digestion anyway, and it hopefully prevents you choking. And there's lots of good reasons to your food. But this is another to say that actually you're probably gaining because of that link between kind of when you move food around in your mouth
Yeah.
and chewing, and then it kind of moves up so that you can smell it. That probably also means that you are gaining more flavor from that experience.
But it gets even more interesting because if you look at neurogastronomy and kind of the neuroscience of food and smells and taste and like how our body actually responds to things, it is really, really fascinating because all of the sensory experiences are actually very closely linked that will respond in us having a specific taste either amplified or some qualities of it changing. And food production companies and the way the packaging is being designed, they're all using some of those principles. So there's been a lot of tests being done. For example, if you will be given a round marble, let's say, and you're feeling round marble in your hands, and at the same time you'll be given, I don't know, a piece of chocolate to eat, for example, and then you ask to rate the sweetness, the saltiness, the all of these different qualities of that chocolate that you are eating on kind of different scale levels, right? So you have these like taste maps when you're tasting things.
Mm.
And then let's say you'd be given exactly the same piece of chocolate, but now in your hands you are actually holding a sharp, square block of like a sanding paper kind of covered thing that is like sharp and so on, right? Now what happens that when you are sensing something round, or even when you are looking at something round, that enhances sweetness. When we're looking at something that is more sharp and more angles, corners, and so on, that enhances some salty effects.
Mm.
There are all of this research done about how different colors affect specific tastes, how different temperatures, textures affect what you taste. And it's incredibly interesting because in gastronomy, in let's say, especially in some of those experiences where using food as art, there are
Yeah.
a lot of these manipulations in what you are seeing, and so on, that it becomes part of an experience that actually enhances the taste of the food. So the food itself might be, nothing special really, but the way it's presented, the way it's introduced to you, in which environment you are in, what color, what sounds you are hearing, actually affects the sense of taste, right? Or perception of that. And sometimes we think it's just a perception, but it's actually neurological effect of how your body processes all these sensations to then translate as something that you say it's a
Mm.
tasty thing. It's very, very interesting.
That's so interesting. And I think, and that's kind of, I suppose it's an example of this low level, or I say low level, I guess it's quite a high level, but different. Some people have an even higher level, but of synesthesia that goes on, where our senses are connected, and one sensing something in one through one sense, so sound, sight, smell, can create, or the experience will be linked across sometimes multiple senses. And I find this so interesting because one of my really good friends has a slight synesthesia with sounds and tastes, and certain words for him. He'll hear the word like cricket and say, oh, I've got a really strong taste of the cakey part of a Jaffa cake. And it will be so specific. It will be extremely specific like that. And there'll be certain, words or sounds that will produce certain flavors. And I find that really, really interesting when we think about that kind of overall experience of eating, or any kind of sensory experience, listening to music, all of these things. It's just another indication of how we can't view our experience or our body or our senses as working in isolation. Everything is connected, and it's to experience that in such subtle, small forms, in terms of, the experience of listening to a song in one circumstance feels very different from listening to a song in another. But we can also then relate to that, to how eating salt is affecting our stress levels, which then affects our aggression levels and personality types, which can then affect, whether we commit a crime or don't commit a crime. And it's fascinating how
it is very interesting. And especially now when we look at these processed foods that are just so far away from how our body is designed to process foods. And when you talk about synesthesia, it's very interesting as well, like all of these connections of senses. And from evolutionary perspective, it makes sense, because when you think about this, now we live in very, very safe and very protected environments, right? You go and you buy something from the shelf. It has your safety stamps. It has your, approvals of high standards and so on. You don't have to worry about, like, will I get poisoned by eating this piece of mushroom or something like that, right? So we completely lost that sense of intuitive kind of knowledge of kind of collecting our food ourselves from nature, and knowing what is good for us and knowing what is harmful, right? What is poisonous, and what are certain things that can be used as medicine, for example. So people used plants as medicines for I don't know how long, right? And now we don't know anymore. We need, a manual to tell us which berry is poisonous, which one is edible. And unless we buy it from the shelf, we are scared to even pick things up ourselves. Yeah. And definitely all of those senses, they were tailored for processing all the information from our environment, so that when we interact with that environment, we know what is the outcome of that, right? So are we poisoning ourselves? Are we curing ourselves? Are we adding some sort of nutrients to our body? What is it exactly that we are doing to ourselves? And those were very intuitive processes. Until nowadays, we still, like, some of those neurogastronomy processes are still trying to kind of understand. So why is that? Because you can test the links between, let's say, smooth round ball and the sweetness of the chocolate. Again, that's the reason why most chocolates will be round, right, rather than presented in some sort of kind of square things. So the sweeter the thing, the more round will be. But when you're buying like a bitter dark chocolate, you're probably not going to be sweet, because that's not what people are looking for, right? They're looking for that bitterness and that saltness, or whatever that other things that they're looking to find. So it's very interesting that when we introduce processed foods, now they also don't look and don't smell and don't appear in their natural form, which means that before we even put that piece of food in our mouth, we already messing up with this entire information processing about what is it just about to happen in our body when we eat this thing, right?
Mm.
So when you go to the forest, you smell the trees, you pick up an apple and you bite it, everything before that bite already been processing, preparing your body to make the most out of that bite, right? The smells, the taste. Now, even when you put something in your mouth, the microbiome in your mouth are actually sending signals to your gut bacteria to then prepare to digest that food before you even swallow it, right? So there are all of these processes that are quite complex and a lot of information that your body is receiving to process this. And that's why one of the biggest challenges in the processed foods is some of this artificial meat production, right? Because if you think that this is a vegan burger or a vegan sausage, your brain cannot comprehend the texture, the taste, what it's supposed to be. And unless you can replicate the look and the taste of meat, of the steak, let's say, people are just don't find it attractive and appealing and they would not eat.
Mm.
So there's been this very interesting experiment done, and I was watching a video and it was really hilarious because they were playing with like colors and textures and so on. So imagine this. So you say you're having a steak, okay? You're having a steak, mash, and peas. But you're having it in some kind of different kind of light. So everything is kind of red, right? So you're not seeing the true color of the food. So you're just assuming that, you are eating that steak, you eating, everything there. And it was interesting because there's a video where, person is eating the steak and the mash and and peas. And then the light comes on and you look at the plate and your steak is blue and your peas are pink.
Wow, that's so
And the
interesting.
response of that person is actually quite revolting because they feel like they want to throw up and they're like looking at it and it's like, but well, and you realize like, what is this color doing? And obviously the meat, we can smell when food goes off, when it looks differently, it smells differently. I know we have now all of these labels of use by dates and what is safe, but actually we can smell it and we know when it's safe to eat that food and when it is not, and when some of this, let's say, color or tech or smell or appearance of that is changing. So your body is literally telling you, don't eat this, right?
Yeah.
As soon as the color changed. There's
Mm.
also like a different thing when you talk about texture. So you ask somebody who loves steak, right? Say you love steak, right? Yeah, I love steak. And I'll say put it in a blender and have it in a form of smoothie. What about the thought of that, right? Would you have that? So everything, like every taste, everything has a meaning behind it, and all of these sensory experiences and all of this dining in the dark experiences also, when you actually don't see what you are eating, so that your sense of smell is maybe enhanced, and your feeling, texture, and so on is different. All of those are so closely linked. And the fact that we're eating so much processed food messes up with all of this kind of neurological mechanism that has evolved over the years to detect what's good and what's harmful in our food and prepare our biological process for making the best from nutritional point of view out of what we are putting in our mouth. So definitely it's, I think, eating as much natural food as possible. And yeah, I
Yeah.
cannot
No,
stress the importance of eating natural.
I agree completely. I've always been very kind of anti these meal replacement shakes and things like that. And then lots of people tout them because it's complete with all the nutrients, but it's not complete because it doesn't have the whole texture of the food. It doesn't have all of those signals that you say, that come from having the food in its natural form, and that affects our digestion, like you say, and what we're taking from it, but also just our relationship with food generally. We should have a relationship with food where we are appreciating it from all of those angles, because that's what connects us with how we can tell whether something is good for us or bad for us. just like you say, if you can smell and see when something's gone off, and if the further we remove ourselves from practicing that skill, like how I wouldn't be able to
You
go.
can't detect that. Yeah.
You can't
Unless
detect
like
it.
the
Yeah.
label says that it's safe to eat, we losing that sense of detecting whether this is right and wrong, and whether this is really good for us, and
Yeah.
our balances in our body of all of this kind of nutritional needs and cravings that we are having are really messed up, and we are not having cravings for the right things. And if we are eating in a right way and natural foods, our cravings can actually tell us what we need,
Mm.
based on what is really missing in our body, rather than this kind of distorted, overly salty, overly sugary processes that are driven by this kind of high level of stress response, high level of energy, high level of blood sugar, high blood pressure. There's all of these things that are being driven by processed foods.
Yeah, certainly. So message of the day, avoid processed foods and try and eat whole foods if you want
Yeah.
to reduce your salt to a healthy degree, and just generally live a kind of healthier life, and nourish that relationship that with our food and with our environment.
Absolutely. So, any questions? Anyone has any other thoughts? We'd love to hear this, and we hope that it was useful. And yeah, see you next week.
Hopefully, see you next week.